expectations about aggregate outcomes. We see that there is a substantial effect of personal experiences on expectations about aggregate outcomes. What we are asking in this paper is what presents personal experiences. And specifically, what we're going to ask is, do local experiences affect expectations about nationwide house prices? We're going to both look at the level as well as the second moment, the variance of these locally experienced house prices, and see to what extent they are going to affect expectations about the aggregate. You can think of this as if personal experiences are just kind of like the national house price changes that we saw recently, then we would expect everyone to kind of have similar experiences across the country. But we don't really think that that is, or we might conjecture that this is not how people form expectation. We might think that someone who lived through the housing boom in Arizona, where prices really exploded and then crashed, might think differently about house prices compared to someone who lived during this time in Indiana, where prices were very stable. And so we're going to test kind of this mechanism. Do people that see different local house price experience think differently about the aggregate house price market in the US? The second part we're going to look at are employment expectations and personal employment status to see whether the own employment status affects expectations about aggregate unemployment. So again, whether something that is close, that is your personal really employment status, whether that has a disproportionate effect on what you think about the unemployment rate. We're then gonna speak a little bit to whether we can infer something about the implications for the expectation formation process from this observation that local experiences matter. What we're going to argue is that what we find is, maybe not surprisingly, inconsistent with full information rational expectation. But we're also going to argue that it is unrelated to proxies of informativeness, and this reliance on local experiences is especially strong for respondents with low analytical ability. And these two observations will let us speak to kind of what type of models of expectation information are consistent with the data once we've moved away from this full information rational expectation framework. The data, as I mentioned, is coming from the New York Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations. It is a monthly panel, and respondents remain in the survey for up to a year. This is kind of special for the survey that it's really a monthly panel, so you have a high frequency panel data. The downside is that it started only in 2012, so the most recent financial crisis is not actually covered in the survey. There are about 1,200 respondents per monthly module, and that adds up to about 8,000 respondents, unique respondents during our sample horizon. The expectations that we look at are a variety of aggregate economic variables, most importantly including house prices and unemployment. We also know some respondent characteristics, such as where they live and their living situation, and things like their education or their numeracy score. So here's what we do. In the first step, we're going to estimate the effect of personal experiences on these expectations about aggregate outcomes. So we're going to estimate beta. How are they related? In step 2, we're then going to think about what does this tell us? How do we interpret beta? We're first going to ask, is this consistent with full information rational expectations? And then second, if it's not, we're going to ask, is it consistent with optimal use of limited information, or is there also a violation there? So here's our main survey question. The survey asks about national house price development. And so it specifically says, we would like you to think about home prices nationwide and about what % you expect average house price to increase or decrease over the next 12 months. So this is our first main outcome. And our proxy for the local house price experience or development is the house price change in the respondent zip code, in the respondent state, or in the respondent's MSA. This is a plot of, on the x-axis, the average house price change in the respondent zip code in the previous year, against the average expected national house price change. And you can see that there's this upward sloping relationship. This is basically the main first finding of the paper in a graph without any controls or anything. But I think it is very striking that even for controlling for like nothing else, you see the strong positive relationship. This is the same for state. State level house prices in the past year against national expectations, again, you see this positive relationship. So now, of course, we're going to not just present this in graphs, we're also going to run the regression, nicely controlling for time effects and individual characteristics. So we're going to regress aggregate expectations on recent house price changes. And what we find is that we see this positive relationship. We see it first for the next year's house price expectations, but also for expectations that are much farther in the future. So the Fed asked this question also about house price changes between 2 and 3 years in the future. And you see that you get a similarly strong relationship, that people who experience higher local price changes expect higher US price changes. Now, we want to ask, well, is this extrapolation kind of like reliance on local information? Does this seem to be justified by the informational content of these expectations? Already from the fact that people use their local house price experiences, we can already reject a full information rational expectation. Why? Because if I have full information about everything that's public, whether I live in New York or Chicago or San Francisco, doesn't matter. I wouldn't know all of this information equally well. And so I wouldn't find that people should systematically put weight on their own over the rest of the country. So that's already rejected here. But now it might be that people use this information optimally in a sense where they have limited information. Maybe it's just like less costly for me to acquire this information, but once I have it, I use it optimally. To test this, we split respondents by how predictive local house prices kind of we think they are for the future aggregate. So you can think of two people. One lives in an area where historically local house prices have moved very strongly with US house prices. And then we take someone where this has not been the case, where local house prices were not very strongly moving with the aggregate. If it is optimal use of limited information, we would expect a much stronger reliance on local house prices for respondents where these house prices have in the past moved more strongly with US house prices. What you see here is that this is not at all the case. We basically get slightly more noisy, but we get kind of like similar estimates across all groups. If you want to interpret the point estimates, the strongest extrapolation is for the medium co-movement with US house price respondents. But importantly, there's really no difference between people who live in high versus low co-movement areas, indicating that there's no difference by how informative these experiences are. Okay. So what I've showed you so far is the experience measured by last year's house price return. But the experience in previous years may matter as well. What tells me that it is just last year? Nothing really. So we're now going to use a measure of the entire history of local house price experiences instead of just the most recent house price to redo this whole analysis and see what we get. We do two approaches. The first one is following Mamedi and Nagel and their work on the personal experiences, where we use a weighted average of past experiences. And there's a weighting parameter lambda that determines whether there's over or under weighting of recent experiences. And we're going to estimate that lambda in our data and see what it tells us. We're going to do this for both fixed and individual specific horizons. That means we're going to look at last 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, or more individual horizons, kind of like since when did you live in this area? How long have you lived there? How old are you? Like when did you start paying attention to house prices? The second approach that we're going to use is a LASSO estimation using all yearly local house price changes. So step back, why can we not just put in all past yearly house price changes into our regression and run with that? Well, house prices are highly serially correlated, and so we would have many collinear regressors, and that would just not estimate well. So we'll have to do something to discipline the model here, either by using the weighted average or by using the LASSO that kind of discipline is as the model in not having very high and very low coefficients to get a kind of like non-linearities. Okay, when we do this, we see that it is really the recent experiences that receive the most weight, and that the reliance on local experiences is unrelated to their informativeness, also when we estimate it with this more encompassing measure of someone's local house price history. Okay, I want to briefly take a closer look at how this works. If I was giving a seminar presentation, I wouldn't go there because I don't think this is particularly helpful, but I do think it is helpful in this context, because I think this weighted average that Mandy and Nagel introduced is just so widely used. And so I want to show you how we use their method and kind of like where it worked well and where it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, what they suggest is to calculate the experience, and we call it A here, as a weighted average of past experiences. And so for us, these are past house price changes. And the weights, they will depend on these lambda parameters that determine whether earlier or later experiences are overweighted. This is the formula, but this doesn't really illustrate well what it does. So here's an illustration. If lambda is 0, this is equal weighting. So every year in the past 10 years receives the same weight. If lambda is negative, then early experiences, kind of experiences that are 10 years in the future, are overweighted more. On the other hand, if lambda is positive, then more recent experiences are overweighted and they receive more weight. There's more weight put on that. And the higher this lambda is, the more these very recent experiences, the more weight they get. So then what we do relative to what we did before, we're going to replace the house price change in the prior year with this weighted average of the history of local house price changes and basically run the exact same regression. Here is how we estimate this lambda. What you see here is the weighting parameter lambda on the x-axis and the fit of the regression is captured by the r-square on the y-axis. And the way what we say is like, well, if we have, say, a 3-year horizon, how do we calculate what is the best fit weighting parameter in the data? We basically look where we get the highest r-squared, where we get the best explanatory power in the data. As you look at this, you can see that you basically get the best, kind of like the highest curve up there with kind of 3, 4, maybe 5 years of past data. Adding more data to the history just doesn't really tend to improve the fit of the data very much. We can do this for individual horizons as well, but that also doesn't improve things very much. So it's really just the last couple of years that seem to be influencing aggregate house price expectations. We can summarize these graphs in a table. And what you see here is first the horizon, and then you see the lambda that gives us the best fit, the highest r-square. The one thing that stands out, and I think that is something that's very useful to know if you're ever going to work with this, is if it is the case that it's really kind of the past recent experiences that matter, then the more you increase the horizon, the higher your lambda will get. Because now you're making the horizon longer, but it really is just the first couple of years that matters. And so the estimation has to counteract that by increasing lambda to ensure that still most of the weight is going to these early experiences. Another way to see this is in this graph. So these are the weights on the most recent years, depending on horizon. So for a 2-year experience, we just have weights on year 1 and 2, whereas for a 10-year horizon, we have weights on year 10. But what you can see is that no matter what horizon we choose, it is really the first 1, 2, 3 years that gets all the weight in this estimation, and everything more than 5 years in the past really doesn't matter very much. However, the nice thing to see here is actually that no matter how we pick the horizon, once we actually use the optimal lambda parameter, the effect of a 1 standard deviation change in this explanatory variable gives us a very, very constant effect on the effect of past house price experiences on expectations. So in some sense, that's nice because it shows us, even if we were to maybe pick the horizon kind of wrong, ultimately we get the right answer, that kind of a 1 standard deviation change in this house price experience variable shifts expectations about the aggregate by about 0.6 to 0.65 for the 1 standard deviation change. This is the alternative, the LASSO estimation. This is with a punishing coefficient of like kind of 0.1. And what you see here is kind of similar, and you get less noise, less fluctuations, kind of the more you punish these like big deviations, is that the highest weight, the highest coefficients are really on the most recent experiences. So this is a very non-linear way to essentially get the same weights that we have here. And you see that while there's noise in the estimation, the conclusion looks very similar. And I think that's a very nice feature here, that we can use both methods and we arrive at very, very similar conclusions, making us more sure and less worried that whatever we are estimating here is driven by our functional form. Okay, back to the results. What I showed you so far was about the first moment. Does the level of past locally experienced house prices change the level of expected national house price changes? The FED survey has a nice feature because it actually doesn't just ask about the point estimate, it elicits a distribution. And so what we're going to ask next is about the second moment. Does the variability of past locally experienced house price changes affect the expected national variability? So if you see higher fluctuations locally, do you report a broader distribution of house price changes expected for the aggregate? This is the way this information is elicited for survey respondents. So they ask, in your view, what would you say is the % chance that over the next 12 months, the average home price change will? And then they're given these buckets and they can allocate 100% into these buckets so that it adds up to 100% in probability. And to measure variability, we use the standard deviation using the midpoints of these ranges. What we then do is we have this expected standard deviation, and we're going to regress it on what was the experienced standard deviation. How much was the volatility of local house prices? Here's what we get. We can calculate the expected standard deviation over different horizons, 5, 10, 20 years, or all of our data. And what we see is that respondents who have experienced more volatile house prices in their zip code, they also report a broader distribution at the national level. Directionally, we see the same at the MSA and kind of at the state level. I want to be honest, at the state level, we're really looking at like 50 observations here, and there isn't that much variation at the state level, so we're lacking power here. But overall, this suggests that this past experience volatility affects also people's stated expectations. And I think that's a nice feature, because any type of story about how people form expectations, if you want to make an argument that the recent experience affects the expectations, we would expect that to go through for both the first and the second level, whereas some confounders would not necessarily explain those. And so this will help us distinguish between possible explanations. Okay, so far, we've used cross-sectional and time variation in local experiences. Ideally, what we would want to do is look at a person, see their experience change, and see how they change their expectations. We can't do that with house prices, but we can do this in the labor market. And so we're going to use as a personal experience an employment status change. And then as expectation, we're going to look at whether people think unemployment will be higher or lower. So in the survey, since we have a monthly panel and people are asked about their current employment status, we know whether they are currently employed or whether they're unemployed or in any other type of labor employment status, both in the current module as well as in the previous module. And so what we're going to exploit is that we have some people, namely 271 people who said that they were employed in the previous module and now are looking for work. And we have slightly more people, 320, who said they were previously looking for work and are now employed. And so we're going to look at how the expectations change as the experience changes. This is a table. It's pretty straightforward. You include an individual fixed effect to absorb anything that is fixed about the person over the survey over this course of like 1 to 3 months. You also include time fixed effects. So to the extent that like the whole economy and the whole economic situation is changing, that would be affecting everyone the same to absorb that. And then you can estimate this regression. And what we see here is that when people are looking for work, when they're unemployed, they think that unemployment going up is more likely. That makes sense. People who maybe are unemployed, who just lost their job, think that unemployment will be higher. People who just found a job actually think that, well, unemployment is going up. They tend to rely on what they see happening to themselves when they think about the overall economy, the overall unemployment rate. Okay, where are we? So what we've done so far, we've shown that local and personal experiences matter, that the reliance on experiences is unrelated to how informative these experiences are. Now, what we want to ask, who are the people who extrapolate? This will help us, again, think about possible explanations because some explanations will predict different sample splits than others. The type of characteristics we're going to look at are first numeracy and whether someone went to college. So this will get at how sophisticated are these people, how comfortable and well-versed are they in basic math. We will then split it also by home ownership and age, and I'll tell you what that will help us think about. We will then relate our experiences to the expectations about other outcomes to see whether we see a general shift in optimism versus pessimism. And then we can think about what this hints at what the mechanism might be. Okay, so here are expectations of US house price changes and to what extent they are influenced by past local house price changes. We now split by whether a respondent has low, medium, or high numeracy. Numeracy is a measure elicited in the survey where people ask basic numeracy math questions. It's questions just like, you invest $100 on a savings account where you get 2% interest rate. After a year, do you have $102 more or less? So it's like kind of simple concepts like this, and then measures how many of these questions people get wrong. What you see here is that people who have low numeracy have consistently stronger reliance on local experiences relative to people who have high numeracy. High numeracy respondents still rely on local experiences when forming their expectations about the aggregate, but to a much, much lesser extent than low numeracy respondents. We see kind of the same picture here for college. So on average, people who didn't go to college rely on past experiences a bit more than people who did go to college. So the difference isn't as big as it is for numeracy. The next split we want to look at is home ownership. So why do we look at home ownership? For those of you who have paid attention to this literature in expectations, there's been a concern about what type of expectation surveys elicit. And so the surveys kind of try to elicit in terms of kind of like probabilities, kind of how likely do you think it is that this unemployment is going up? How likely do you think that house prices are going up? By how much do you think they will go up? What's your expectation about that? But there's a concern that people have brought up in this context of surveys repeatedly showing that past or personal experiences affect these stated expectations, kind of these probabilities. And that is that people might be reporting risk-adjusted probabilities rather than true probabilities. The idea here is that if I've had a recent bad experience, then it is not necessarily that I expect now unemployment to go up more. It might be that I'm just become more risk averse, and when I risk adjust my expectations, this risk adjustment makes me look more pessimistic. The opposite on the upside, if I've had like a great run in my job and I found a new job, I become less risk averse, so I'll risk adjust less and I will look more optimistic, even though my kind of expectation really for what unemployment will do hasn't changed, but what I report, which is risk adjusted, might change. Okay? So if you now think that that maybe sounds a little bit far-fetched, maybe when I first heard that, I was like, what? Do you think survey respondents think about risk adjusting their expectations? Probably most people don't even know what that means. So maybe you can have your own opinion about whether you think that is plausible, but that is a potential criticism. And so we thought about how we could address it. And here's what we came up with. We split our sample by whether someone is a homeowner or whether someone is a renter, not a homeowner. So now, if past local house prices are going up, that is good for you as a homeowner because your house has just increased in price. If past local house prices have been going down, then that's bad for you if you're a homeowner because your home has just fallen in value. And so if we see homeowners kind of looking like they rely on past local price changes when forming their expectations going forward about the aggregate, this risk adjustment could plausibly explain that. But now we're going to look at renters. And so for renters, the risk adjustment should go in the opposite way. Why? Well, if you're a renter and local house prices fall, that's probably good for you. You don't own local real estate. If prices fall, your rent is more likely to go down. And if you want to eventually buy, if you want to become a homeowner, it's also good for you that prices just fall. It's going to be cheaper for you to become a homeowner. So risk adjustment should go in the opposite direction for renters. The same is true on the upside. If house prices have gone up, that might be great for homeowners, but it's not great for renters. Their rent will go up. It's harder to buy a house now because prices have just gone up. And so for them, this is actually bad news. They should be risk adjusting more. In short, what that means is that we should expect that the effect of renters relative to homeowners is dampened in the way that they rely on local experiences if risk adjusting is a significant factor here. What you see is that it's not at all the case. The renters actually, if you look at the point estimates of anything, they rely more on local experience. They definitely don't significantly rely less on them. The point estimate goes the other way around. So that indicates that what we see here is unlikely due to reporting risk-adjusted expectations. It's more likely that people simply rely on those local experiences when forming their expectations. Finally, we split it by age. What you see here is that it's actually pretty stable in our data, how much people rely on those recent local experiences until age 60. So there's really no change here very much. And so any big cohort effects don't tend to show up here for house prices. So let's summarize. Who extrapolates? Less sophisticated respondents. There's no difference by home ownership, and there's not a big difference below age 60. We find the same pattern if we look at the unemployment expectations. Very consistent across those really same patterns. We also do some splits that I don't want to show you here. There's no difference by the region where people live. There's no difference by the peak to trough price during the crisis. And there's no difference by the past volatility in their local region. The last piece to put this together is looking at other types of expectations. So people ask a range of questions from, do you think you will be better off? Are you better off than a year from now? What do you think about interest rates, your stocks, inflation, government debt? So now what we're going to look at is whether our home prices or our employment status affect expectations about these other outcomes as well. So in panel A, we see the effect of employment status. So here what you really should focus on is the first line, whether someone is looking for work. So whether there was a change, and this is with individual fixed effects, for whether this person transitioned between unemployment and employment. And what we see here is that people who are currently unemployed think that they are worse off, and they think they will be worse off a year from now compared to people who didn't experience that change. That makes sense. I mean, losing your job is not a great thing. And so this idea that it affects your own outlook is very consistent with this. However, when you look here is, we don't really see an effect of looking for work on any of these other outcome variables. No effect on interest rate, stock market, inflation, or government debt. Then, when you look in the second panel, B, we do the same for local house price changes. And again, you see no effect whatsoever. Local house price changes don't seem to systematically affect or strongly affect whether people personally think they're going to be better or worse off. And it also doesn't affect their outlook to the economy more broadly. So what this tells us is that any effect is not due to a general shift in sentiment, but more that it is very domain specific. Employment status strongly affects expectations about unemployment. Housing experiences strongly affects expectations about housing, but it doesn't shift everything up or down where we would think of a general sentiment shift. Okay, the last things I want to talk about is first an effect on outcomes and then some data validation issues. Effect on outcomes. So as I mentioned, this is a survey. So we have great data on expectations, but we don't have great data on outcomes. We do have two pieces that hint at that a little bit. The first one is that because we have a panel, we can actually see whether people become unemployed or not as they report their employment status. And we also have a question that asks them about how likely they think that they themselves will lose their jobs. And so what we find is that people that think they're more likely to lose their job are actually more likely to lose their job. That's nice. That's kind of just a validation of like what people tell us isn't completely detached from reality. No, there's informational content. If I had to pick out who's most likely to lose their job by asking people, I would be able to, in fact, pick out those people who are more likely to lose their job. There's also some data on intended actions in the housing market, kind of whether people are moving, whether they want to buy a house, whether they want to renovate, and things like that. And that's also consistent with an effect on intended actions. They're more likely to make investment in the housing market along those lines, or at least say that they would like to do this. We also do some data validation. So I think one concern might be that it looks like people kind of rely on local house price experiences when forming expectations about the aggregate. But one condition for this to really be true is that they have to know about local house prices. And so we show in the survey that respondents actually have a decent directional sense of past local house price changes. So if house prices have gone up more, they kind of understand that and they know that, and they tell us that they think house prices have gone up more. Because for some people, we also have what they thought house price changes were in their local area. And we can use this to look at the following. Well, we showed that people rely on that what actual house price changes were in their local area affects how they think about aggregate house prices going forward. So now we first showed that they actually have a good directional sense. Now, for a subset of people, we actually know what they thought happened in their local market. And so now we can test whether, if we know what they think happened, in the cases that that differs from what actually happened, what is the more predictive measure? And when we do this, we find that there's much stronger extrapolation from the recall price change compared to the actual price change. And that makes sense because clearly people are extrapolating or kind of relying on what they think happened and not necessarily what actually happened in case these two differ. And so that's, again, another piece of evidence that our data here is informative, that we're really picking up this mechanism of people think this is what happened, and that's what they use to make their predictions. We also, our results, and I think this is a concern again with all surveys, that people might not understand the questions. That's a difficult concern to rule out, because in some sense, how are you going to argue that no, they understood what I was trying to tell them? But here is what we do. We're going to argue that when people are, if people can't distinguish between different kind of like nationwide house prices and local house prices, then if we ask them about both, they should give us very similar answers, because it just would seem like the same question to them. But this is not what we find. In the survey, people are asked both about nationwide as well as about local house prices, and they give different answers. But most importantly, we find that people who we think actually maybe would be more likely to not understand that, like people with no college degree, people who have low numeracy, they're actually less likely than more educated respondents to give us the same answers. And so that's consistent with them really understanding that it's two different types of questions and it is not the same. And we're asking them about two different things. Okay, let me sum up. So what we show in this paper is that recent personal experiences systematically affect expectations about the aggregate. We see this for the level of house prices, and we see it for the variability, the spread of house prices. We see this in the housing market as well as for US unemployment when experiencing unemployment. And so we very consistently see here across two domains, the housing and the labor market, in both the level and the second moment, the variability, that past local, past personal experiences affect expectations in the same domain. This kind of extrapolation is unrelated to a proxy of the informational content. So it doesn't seem to be driven by optimal use of even potentially limited information. So that kind of tells us that maybe some form of behavioral model that explains expectation information might be a better fit for our data here than a strictly rational one, where we think that people optimally interpret the signals that they are getting. The consistent with this, the effect is stronger for less sophisticated respondents, people who didn't go to college, people who don't score very highly on the numeracy score. Again, this points towards maybe less of an optimal use of information, because if it was optimal use, we kind of would expect more sophisticated, more numerically literate respondents to do this more rather than the opposite, to do this less. And finally, we find that there's no effect on expectations about other outcomes. And so this seems to be domain specific. It doesn't filter through to the general economy. Like if I ask you about unemployment, you think about your own employment status and that affects it. But then if I ask you about interest rates or stock prices, your employment status doesn't really affect that anymore. And so generally, that's kind of consistent with a naive-ish extrapolation from personal experiences, where what comes to mind, what is close to me in that domain, I rely on when being asked about my expectations in this domain going forward. Okay, That was that on expectations about aggregate outcomes. I want to recap a tiny little bit the paper you saw, if you saw it last time, for peer effects. Why? Because I think this paper is often thought as a peer effects paper, but I really think of it as an expectations paper as well. So this is the paper that Johannes presented last time on the economic effects of social networks, evidence from the housing market. For those of you who didn't see it or maybe don't quite remember, this is what the paper does. It provides empirical evidence for the following story. First, that individuals discuss property investments with their friends, and that based on these experiences, this exchange with their friends, they adjust their expectations about housing. So basically what it says is, if I'm thinking about local house price investment, I talk to my friends, I talk to my family, and what they see, what I hear from them affects how I think about my local house prices. And then second, the paper argues that by influencing expectations, these social interactions have a large effect on actual housing investment decisions. The decisions that we look at in that paper are the extensive margin, whether or not you become a homeowner, the intensive margin, how big of a house do you buy, and the willingness to pay, how much do you pay for a house. And so you can think of these as pitching the finding in two directions. The first one is, well, social interactions affect housing investment decisions. But the other thing is, what beliefs really translate into housing investment decisions? Because what I see is, I see that my friends affect my beliefs, and my beliefs affect my housing investment decisions. So beliefs play an important role when I'm thinking about housing. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because housing is a long-term investment for most people. Whether I want to buy or rent depends on what I think will happen to house prices or rents. How much I'm willing to pay for my house depends on how much, what I will think about house prices going forward, because the house is in some sense it's a consumption good. I might live there, but it's also for most people the biggest financial asset that they have. And so through affecting beliefs, these social interactions affect those outcomes, but that also tells us about how strongly beliefs translates into action. So that's the takeaway. How does the paper get there? The paper uses 3 sources of data. And I tell you on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the empirical strategy of how it gets here. The first one is the social network data that's coming from Facebook. The second is a survey about expectations that was run on Facebook. And that's going to establish that first part, that first bullet point of, well, people do discuss housing with their friends and family, and the discussions that they're having affects their expectations about local house price changes. So we can show that in the survey elicited expectations, it does that. The third data set is for the second part. Housing investment decisions, that comes from housing needs data. This is in the US public data. And so we can look at whether people who buy a house, it has all housing transactions, whether people buy a house and how much they pay for the house and what type of house they buy. So I want to talk a little bit about how the empirical strategy for that paper works. So in the first part, we are going to show that these friends' house price experiences affect beliefs about local housing market investments. In the second step, and this is done by, linking the survey where respondents are asked about local housing market beliefs, how attractive they think it is, to their friends and what the house price movements in the friends' location were. Okay? And so now I'm going to show, and then we're going to show that these friend experiences are going to affect the survey responses. This is with 1,200 responses roughly in a survey. So now we see that these affect expectations, but now we want to make that link to actual housing market investments. So ideally, what would be amazing if we had these friend experiences, people's beliefs about housing market investments, and then we could see what they actually do. We don't have that data. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at not that triangle, how do friend experiences affect beliefs, and then how do these beliefs affect investments, we're going to look at the direct link between friend experiences and individual housing market investments. The big advantage here is that if we don't need the survey data, we can do this for way more people. We can do this for hundreds of thousands of observations in LA for everyone who bought a house that we can match to their friend network on Facebook. And that's a lot more people than we can run the survey for. But because we don't have that direct link, we're going to need to make that argument in 2 steps. We're first going to show that there's this correlation between friend experiences and individual housing market investments. And then, and if you go and read the paper, that's like the vast part of the argument of the paper, we're going to argue that the effect comes through no other channel except expectations. And by making that argument, we're going to be able to argue that by affecting beliefs, expectations, social interactions are going to affect individual housing market investments. Or if we want to focus on that paper in this class, we can argue that friend experiences affect beliefs, and by that we can show that through affecting beliefs, beliefs affect investments, and so the beliefs that people hold about housing are strongly affecting how they act, how they invest in the housing market. So this was the second part of this paper. It's basically this idea that I alluded to earlier, using variation in friend experiences as shifters of expectations, and then looking at the effect on housing investments. You will see the same strategy 2 weeks from now, actually in our mortgage session, where we're going to use, again, the variation in friend experiences as a shift of expectations, and we're going to look at testing a theory about how beliefs affect mortgage leverage choice. I want to be straightforward about both the upsides as well as the downsides of the strategy. I think the upside really is that finding such a shifter and then arguing that an effect can only come through expectations allows you to study actual choices without having real expectation data, and kind of identify that causal shift, and then basically run the reduced form when you don't have the IB variable. Of course, this only works if you can credibly establish the experience shifter, but most importantly, if you can rule out alternative channels. And that's a hard thing to do. That is something, that's a strategy that we've now done it. It can work, so it's not something to despair about. But I want to be honest, is that it is a challenging strategy because you basically have to rule out every single possible confounding factor that someone or a referee throws at you. And so you're going to spend a lot of time doing that. So be prepared. It is another alternative to our standard applied micro tools, but it is not one that that is easy or straightforward. It is one where you have to do a lot of legwork.